It was a sunny afternoon, the kind that seemed to promise nothing but peace. The sun was high in the sky, casting a warm glow over everything. The birds were chirping in the trees, and the soft breeze rustled the leaves. I was sitting at my desk, finishing some paperwork and enjoying the tranquility. My daughter, Sarah, was in the living room, working on one of her puzzles. She loved solving puzzles, though with her impaired vision, it took her longer than most people. Still, she never gave up. The house was calm, too calm, as if everything had slowed down to a gentle rhythm. That was until I heard it. The sound of tires screeching outside my home broke through the stillness. At first, I thought it was just another car speeding by, the kind of thing that happens on any busy street. But then, the sound grew louder. More frantic. My gut twisted as a sense of unease crept over me. The screeching continued for several seconds, louder and closer, like it was heading straight for us. Something didn't feel right. My heart started to race, my pulse quickening. I dropped my pen, pushed back from my desk, and rushed to the window, hoping to make sense of the strange noise. My mind was already bracing for something unexpected, but I wasn't prepared for what I saw. I froze. There, in the front yard, standing just a few steps from our driveway, was Karen. She lived a few houses down the block and had always been a troublemaker. She was the type to complain about anything, from loud kids playing outside to leaves on the sidewalk. Her presence always seemed to cast a shadow over the neighborhood, and no one ever stood up to her because of her ruthless approach to enforcing her rules around the block. But this time, there was something different. Something sinister. Karen wasn't yelling at anyone. She wasn't standing with her hands on her hips or wagging a finger at someone. No, she was holding something, a gun. And the worst part? My daughter was right there, standing in her path. Sarah had been playing outside, slowly moving down the driveway with her walker, oblivious to the danger that was fast approaching. I didn't have time to think. My mind went blank as I watched Karen point the gun directly at Sarah. She had no idea what was happening. Sarah couldn't even see clearly enough to understand that she was in danger. I felt a rush of panic. My legs turned to lead, but I forced myself to move. The air seemed to thicken around me as I stood frozen, unable to scream, unable to do anything but watch in horror. In the blink of an eye, I saw Karen pull the trigger. A sharp crack echoed in the air as the bullet tore through the space between them, striking my daughter in the leg. Sarah let out a pained scream, and my body snapped into motion. I couldn't process what I had just seen. How could this be happening? How could someone do this to my daughter, to a defenseless child who had done nothing wrong? My mind was racing, the world spinning around me. I was paralyzed for a moment, not from fear, but from disbelief. Was I dreaming? Was this a nightmare that would soon fade away? I stood there, feeling utterly helpless, staring at my daughter's face as she clutched her leg, her eyes wide in shock and pain. It didn't make sense. Why would Karen shoot her? What could possibly justify this level of violence? But then, something inside me snapped. I wasn't just a father standing there, watching my daughter suffer. I was someone who had spent years in the legal system, someone who had the knowledge and the authority to ensure that justice was served. I was a federal judge. This wasn't just an act of random violence, this was a crime. And no one, not even someone like Karen, was above the law. I rushed outside, barely feeling the ground beneath my feet. Sarah was still crying, her face twisted in pain. I kneeled beside her, trying to comfort her, but my mind was already moving, already planning. I needed to make sure that Karen couldn't get away with this. I needed to ensure that she faced the consequences of what she had done. The police arrived quickly, but the damage had already been done. Karen was still standing there, as if in a trance, the gun still in her hand. I could barely hold back my anger as the officers took her into custody. But even as they hauled her away, I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I would make sure that Karen faced the full extent of the law. No one, no matter who they were, had the right to take the law into their own hands like this. Not while I had the power to stop it. But as I held Sarah in my arms, trying to comfort her, I realized that what had happened couldn't be undone. The fear, the pain, the confusion, all of it was real. And I was left to pick up the pieces of the shattered calm we had once known. I looked down at my daughter, clutching her leg in pain, her face pale and filled with confusion. My heart was torn in two as I tried to comfort her, whispering that everything would be okay. But I knew, deep down, that things would never be the same again. The serene life we had built in our quiet neighborhood had just been shattered, and there was no way to undo the damage that had been done. But what struck me the hardest wasn't just the physical pain that Sarah was enduring, it was the brutal reality of the situation. Karen had shot my daughter, and for what? Because of some petty disagreement over HOA rules? The more I thought about it, the more absurd it seemed. There was no way this was just about a simple misunderstanding or a misplaced grievance. This was something far worse. As a federal judge, I had spent years interpreting the law, upholding justice, and ensuring that those who broke the law faced the consequences of their actions. I had seen all kinds of cases, fraud, corruption, even murder, but this felt personal. No law-abiding citizen should have to worry about a neighbor with a gun, especially not when that neighbor had a history of controlling and intimidating others with the power of the HOA. I had seen the lengths people like Karen would go to enforce their small, petty rules, but this was on a whole different level. I could hear her voice, shouting about Sarah's actions. She broke the rules. She didn't follow the guidelines, Karen screamed, her words trembling with a strange mix of anger and frustration. It didn't make sense. Sarah wasn't even capable of fully understanding those rules. She couldn't walk without help and had limited sight. How could she possibly have done anything to provoke Karen to such an extreme? I could feel my own anger rising. I had spent my life ensuring that justice was served, and now it was my turn to make sure that Karen faced the consequences of her reckless actions. This wasn't just an assault on my daughter, it was an assault on everything I stood for as a judge. This was an attack on the principle of fairness, on the safety of my family, and on the rights of every person who lives in a community governed by law. I wasn't going to let this go, not now, not ever. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911 without hesitation, my hand steady despite the chaos of the moment. As I spoke to the operator, I made sure every detail was accurately relayed: the location of the incident, Karen's identity, the fact that Sarah had been shot, and how urgent the situation was. The operator reassured me that help was on the way, but I didn't let my guard down. I knew how crucial it was to act swiftly, to make sure that the authorities had all the information they needed to respond appropriately. The minutes felt like hours as I stayed by Sarah's side, doing my best to comfort her. I could see the fear in her eyes, and it broke me to pieces. She didn't understand why someone would want to hurt her, and as a father, it was the most helpless feeling in the world to see my child in pain and confusion. And then, the sound of sirens in the distance. The authorities arrived quickly, and I felt a sense of relief wash over me. But that relief was short-lived. Karen was still there, standing in the yard, the gun still clutched tightly in her hand. She didn't seem to understand the severity of the situation. There was no remorse in her eyes, only a twisted sense of righteousness, as if she truly believed she was justified in what she had done. The police moved swiftly, disarming her and taking her into custody. But even as they did so, I couldn't shake the disbelief that lingered in my mind. How had it come to this? How had someone allowed their power to become so all-encompassing that they would resort to violence to enforce their authority? The questions kept swirling in my mind, and the anger only continued to build. I stayed calm, relying on my legal training to handle the situation as efficiently as possible. I knew what had to be done next. The authorities would investigate the case, but I wouldn't sit idly by. I would make sure that Karen faced every charge she deserved. I would make sure my daughter's pain was not in vain, that her suffering would not be forgotten. As I watched Karen being led away in handcuffs, I couldn't help but feel a sense of justice beginning to take shape. But it wasn't over yet. This was just the beginning. I would make sure the system held Karen accountable, and that Sarah would never be made to feel afraid in her own neighborhood again. I looked down at my daughter again, her face now flushed with the pain of the injury but also with the understanding that her father would fight for her. And that's exactly what I planned to do. I would fight not just for her, but for every person who had ever been unjustly hurt or threatened. The law was there for a reason, and I wasn't going to let Karen's actions go unpunished. Not while I was still breathing. As the days passed, the initial shock of the incident began to settle, but the questions continued to linger. What had truly driven Karen to this extreme? At first, it seemed like a senseless outburst, a crazy neighbor, a petty HOA enforcer, and an incident that escalated far beyond anything anyone could have imagined. But as the investigation moved forward, I began to see a pattern, one that suggested this wasn't just an isolated event. This was the culmination of months, perhaps even years, of unchecked behavior. I decided to take matters into my own hands, not just as a father seeking justice, but as a federal judge determined to understand what had really happened. I returned to the scene, walking through the now quiet neighborhood that had once felt so safe. Everything was the same, the pristine lawns, the neatly trimmed hedges, the white picket fences. But beneath the surface, something had gone terribly wrong. The peace of this suburban paradise had been shattered, and it was clear that Karen had played a pivotal role in the chaos. I reviewed the surveillance footage from the cameras outside my house, my mind racing as I watched the scene unfold once again. Karen's face was filled with rage, her finger steady on the trigger. It was chilling to see it again, but I needed to understand how we had arrived at this point. The more I watched, the more I realized that the shooting wasn't some random act of aggression. It was calculated, deliberate, and fueled by something much deeper than just a disagreement over neighborhood rules. I spoke with several of the neighbors, many of whom had experienced Karen's wrath firsthand. She had built a reputation over the years for bullying anyone who didn't comply with her idea of what the neighborhood should look like. If you didn't mow your lawn on the right day, if your fence wasn't the right shade of white, or if your trash cans weren't in the proper position, Karen would be there with a complaint, an accusation, and often, a threat. She was a tyrant, and the HOA board had allowed her to operate unchecked. It was clear that Karen had been pushing for control for far too long, and when Sarah had made the smallest mistake, a tiny infraction with the lawn that didn't even violate the HOA's strict guidelines, Karen had snapped. She took it personally, as if Sarah had attacked her authority. But instead of reprimanding Sarah or even issuing a warning, Karen chose to escalate things to a level that no one, especially a disabled child, should ever have to face. The more we uncovered about Karen's history with the HOA, the more we realized that this wasn't just about one woman's obsession with power. The HOA, as an organization, had become a breeding ground for toxicity. They had allowed Karen to operate with impunity, turning a blind eye to her increasingly erratic behavior. They had created an environment where Karen felt justified in taking matters into her own hands, where she believed she could control people's lives with threats and intimidation. And when things didn't go her way, when she couldn't get Sarah to comply with her version of the rules, she resorted to violence. But there was more. As the investigation continued, we learned that Karen had been under immense pressure in her personal life. Her finances were in turmoil, her marriage was falling apart, and she had been struggling with deep feelings of inadequacy. But none of that was an excuse for what she had done. The law didn't care about her personal problems. The law cared about the victims, and in this case, the victim was my daughter. I made sure to use everything I had learned in the investigation to ensure that justice was served. I wasn't going to let Karen slip through the cracks, no matter how much she tried to justify her actions. The case went to trial, and with my background in the law, I was able to ensure that the proceedings moved swiftly and that there was no room for error. Every piece of evidence was carefully presented, and every witness was heard. It became clear that Karen was the aggressor, and the only question was what charges she would face. In the end, Karen was convicted on multiple charges, including attempted murder, assault, and unlawful use of a firearm. The jury found her guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, and the judge handed down a long prison sentence. She would spend years behind bars, unable to harm anyone else. But the story didn't end there. The HOA board members who had turned a blind eye to Karen's behavior were also held accountable. They had allowed her to foster an environment of fear and control, and they had failed to take action when they should have. The board members were also investigated and faced legal consequences for their role in enabling Karen's reign of terror. It was a bittersweet victory, knowing that my daughter's suffering would never be fully undone, but that at least the people responsible would be held accountable. Looking back on the trial, I couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. I had done my duty as a judge, ensuring that the law was upheld, but I was also a father, and as a father, nothing could bring back the peace that had been lost. Still, I found some comfort in knowing that Karen and the HOA's enablers would no longer have the power to terrorize anyone else. Justice had been served, and that, at least, was something.